Because my wife, Sophia, suffered from depression, I was her only doctor. However, she believed that I was controlling her, so she destroyed my career and killed me with a kitchen knife. I thought she would be happy, but instead, she clutched my photo, kneeling in the psychiatric hospital, begging me to save her once more.
The story is about to begin. If you like it, remember to subscribe. It was already 11 at night, and Sophia hadn't come home yet. This had been happening since 3 days ago. Whenever she had a gathering with her classmates in the past, she would come home quietly, tiptoeing around to avoid waking me up. But these past few days, she slammed the door shut and walked around noisily in her slippers, as if she didn't want me to wake up at all. When she lay down beside me, she reeked of alcohol. Each time, I tried to call out to her, "Sophia, Sophia," but she didn't respond, though I knew she was awake. She just didn't want to talk to me. As the clock struck midnight, I couldn't hold back any longer and called her. I tried 3 times before she finally answered. "Hello?"
Sophia's voice, thick with intoxication, came through the line, tinged with impatience. My heart sank slowly, but I still managed to ask gently, "Sophia, where are you?
Why aren't you back yet? Now, why do you have to control me so much?" Sophia interrupted me loudly. I was taken aback. Sophia had never spoken to me so harshly before. But I continued, "You haven't taken your medicine today."
Her voice was filled with suspicion. "I'm not sick."
"You're trying to force me to take medicine again, aren't you? Let me tell you."
There was a clatter, probably the phone falling to the ground, and Sophia's voice became distant. I couldn't understand why she was suddenly so resistant to taking her medicine. Someone picked up the phone, and a languid voice laughed, "Dr. James, it's because you make her take medicine every day that she got depression in the first place. Look at how happy she is now, out having fun."
Amidst the noise, I heard a woman's frantic scream. It was Sophia.
I had never heard her make such a sound before. I am a psychiatrist, and Sophia was my patient.
Depression treatment usually involves family or friends accompanying the patient, but when Sophia first came to see me, she was alone.
She walked straight into my office without any family member, and later, she walked into my life. At that time, Sophia stood at the door of my office, looking dazed and thin as a withered leaf in late autumn. At first, she didn't want to say anything, just biting her lip and sitting there. Under my guidance, she gradually opened up. Sophia said her family had never valued her, neither financially nor emotionally. Even when she got good grades, she never received encouragement. Instead, the slightest mistake would lead to ridicule, verbal abuse, and physical violence. Once, she was beaten with a solid iron rod by her mother for dropping a grain of rice while eating. Sophia tried to protect herself with her arm, and the next day, she had 4 or 5 bruises on it. When her teacher at school asked if she was being bullied, she said it was her mother. She seemed to treat it as a joke, but as she laughed, she began to cry, tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. Sophia trembled as she said, "Dr. James, there's only 1 year left until the college entrance exam, and I want to get better." Her eyes, which had been lifeless, suddenly sparkled with a glimmer of hope and longing for a better life. I decided to help her. After that, she came for treatment every 2 weeks. Gradually, her mental state improved, her appetite returned, and she gained some weight. That year, she did well in the college entrance exam and was admitted to her dream school. When the admission results were announced, Sophia ran into my office, jumping with joy, and hugged me tightly.
"Dr. James, I got in," she exclaimed, waving the admission letter in my face.
I smiled at her and said, "That's great.
Congratulations." But then she blushed, lowered her head, and said, "Dr. James, I really like you. Can we be together?" I was taken aback. My mentor had once warned me about transference, the phenomenon where a patient develops emotional feelings for their doctor. Over the years, I had always been careful to avoid such situations. Whenever it happened, I would subtly distance myself. But this time, I silently apologized to my mentor in my heart. I realized that I had also developed feelings for Sophia. I was moved by her resilience, kindness, and sincerity. I accompanied Sophia through 4 years of college, and after graduation, we got married. Over the years, she had been doing well, with hardly any relapses of her depression, until today. No, it should be 3 days ago. After ending the call with Sophia, I realized how slow I had been. She must have been influenced by someone else to behave this way. I needed to find out who that man was. I called Sophia's friend Emily. "Ah, Dr. James, what can I do for you?"
Her voice sounded a bit awkward.
I got straight to the point. "Emily, do you know who Sophia has been spending time with lately? Who has she been with?"
Emily tried to change the subject. Suppressing my anger, I said, "Emily, you know Sophia has depression. I just spoke to her, and she doesn't seem to be in a good mental state."
I need to know what's going on. Do you understand?
There was a pause before she slowly said, Sophia has been with her ex-boyfriend.
Ex-boyfriend? I was stunned.
Sophia had never mentioned him to me, not even during her therapy sessions. Emily seemed to have made up her mind and told me, his name is David.
He was the last straw for Sophia.
They broke up in high school, and that's when her depression got worse. She paused and added, thankfully, you came along, Dr. James.
Without wasting any more time, I thanked her and hung up.
At that moment, the sound of a key turning in the lock came from the door. Sophia stumbled in, disheveled and unsteady. I quickly grabbed the medicine and a glass of water from the table and handed it to her. She glanced at it, then pushed me forcefully, sending the pills scattering across the floor and shattering the glass.
James, let me tell you, stop trying to control me,
she shouted, her eyes bloodshot as she glared at me. I knew she was drunk and didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I squatted down to pick up the broken glass. But she stepped on my hand. I felt a sharp, stinging pain from the combination of her high heel and the shards of glass. With my other hand, I grabbed her ankle and moved her foot away, wincing in pain.
Sophia, are you crazy?
I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though it trembled a little.
I looked at my hand.
Although Sophia wasn't very strong in her drunken state, blood still seeped from my palm, and there was a round imprint from her high heel on the back of my hand. Sophia, however, began to sob uncontrollably, as if she had been terribly wronged. I knew it, you're just pretending.
You've always been impatient with me.
She choked out her words, gasping for breath. I saw that helpless girl again and tried to calm myself. Gently, I said, come on, Sophia, let's take some deep breaths.
Before I could finish, Sophia pushed me forcefully. Are you trying to manipulate me again? I'm telling you, I have my own mind.
Before I could respond, she staggered into the bedroom. Deep breathing was a technique I had taught her during her first therapy session when she struggled to catch her breath. Whenever she became agitated, I would remind her to use this method to calm down. But today, she was resisting. No, something was off.
I knew it had to do with David. I collapsed onto the sofa, clenching my fists.
The pain from my wound was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. The next morning, when Sophia woke up and saw me sitting on the sofa, I had actually been there all night, lost in thought. Sophia looked at my haggard face. Normally, she would have shown concern, but this time, she pretended not to see it. She frowned and started to get ready for the day.
I stopped her and asked, Sophia, who is David?
I could have called Emily again, but I wanted to hear it from her. Sure enough, she froze, turned to look at me, and said with a dark look in her eyes, how do you know about him?
Without answering, I continued, were you with him yesterday?
But Sophia muttered to herself, it must have been Emily, that bitch. I had never heard her curse before and couldn't help but interrupt, Sophia, that's enough. She tilted her head and smiled, a coquettish look I had never seen before. I slept with David, and then he dumped me.
Are you satisfied now?
I felt my blood turn to ice. It wasn't because she had been with someone else, but because David, that scumbag, had deceived and abandoned Sophia, and now he was trying to push her back into the abyss.
I blurted out, that guy is a jerk. Stay away from him. Sophia's expression turned strange, so David was right. You just want to gaslight me.
I thought I had misheard. What are you saying?
You want to drive everyone away from me so that I belong to you and only you, don't you?
She laughed triumphantly. I should have seen through you sooner. I'd been fooled by you for all these years.
Sophia, what are you talking about?
I screamed in my heart in despair.
How could I have gaslighted her? How could I have deceived her?
Everything I had done since the first time I met her was to help her.
But I couldn't bring myself to say it. Sophia kept talking, but I just listened numbly. James, let's get a divorce, she said. Hearing this, I felt my frozen heart shatter. What did you say? My voice didn't even sound like my own.
I don't want to be controlled by you anymore, she said coldly, as if I had always been a stranger to her.
After the divorce, all the assets will be mine. Hearing this, I let out a bitter laugh. When we got married, Sophia didn't even inform her parents.
She proposed to me with the $10,000 she had saved from her first job. I felt bad for her struggling alone and worried that she lacked a sense of security, so I had a prenuptial agreement done, putting the house and car in her name. Now it seemed I had pushed myself into a pit of fire. I looked up and met Sophia's gaze. Her eyes still had a hint of redness, like a crazy but calm criminal, but his eyes are like an eternal glacier without a trace of emotion.
Sophia, we've been together for 5 years. How can you be so heartless? I asked. I didn't agree to the divorce.
I couldn't believe that in just a few days, she could forget all the time we had spent together. I didn't want her to continue being deceived by that scumbag David. I wanted us to go back to the beginning, or at least to 5 days ago. But Sophia was far more ruthless than I had imagined. After that unpleasant conversation with Sophia, I went to work. However, I hadn't been seated for long when the door was kicked open, despite my assistant Robert's attempts to stop the intruder. The man who entered had striking features and bright red hair. I sized him up calmly, knowing he was David. He walked straight in, sat down on the chair opposite me, and casually propped his legs up on the desk, right on top of my stack of files. "James," he said, glancing at the nameplate on the desk. Not wanting to make a scene in public, I kept my voice low. "What do you want?" He leaned forward, staring at me with a smirk. "Sophia said you won't agree to the divorce." Did Sophia tell him everything? Bitterness welled up inside me, but before I could respond, he continued, "What's so great about that bitch? I slept with her and she's too afraid to tell you." I grabbed the front of his shirt, my arm muscles bulging with anger. Robert peeked in from the doorway, and with a glance from me, he quickly shut the door. David didn't seem fazed at all, as if he had expected this reaction. He let out a dismissive laugh. "James, you think you're saving people, but you're just a sucker." "A sucker? Maybe that's what Sophia thought of me too." I lost my strength and pushed David back. He stumbled, looked at me with pity, and said, "Dr. James, you should just agree to the divorce." He turned to leave, and as he opened the door, he added, "Otherwise, you'll regret it." Shortly after David left, my first patient arrived. She was an introverted girl whose voice was as soft as a mosquito's buzz when she answered my questions. Her mother, on the other hand, talked incessantly like a machine gun. Whenever the girl was slow to respond, her mother would slap her on the head. I thought of Sophia, her mother was probably similar. Noticing my distraction, the mother grew increasingly annoyed. "Dr. James, are you even listening to me?" I offered an apologetic smile, trying to refocus, but the noise outside grew louder. The door was kicked open for the second time, this time by a middle-aged man and woman. "Mr. G, how dare you deceive in marriage?" The woman shouted first, her voice like thunder. I saw a resemblance to Sophia in her face and knew who they were. They had come to settle scores. The middle-aged man lacked confidence but still piped up, "James, you married my daughter without our knowledge." The mother-daughter duo nearby couldn't sit still anymore. They tried to sneak out quietly, but Sophia's mother grabbed the other woman's arm and shouted, "Sister, you didn't know, right? My daughter was being treated here, and he took advantage of it to get involved with her. You should be careful too." The machine gun woman, who had been indifferent until then, immediately changed her expression. She looked at me as if I were a pervert, grabbed her daughter's hand, and hurried out. Sophia's mother looked at me triumphantly. "What do you think now, Dr. James? I was right, wasn't I?" I bit my lip and stayed silent. Sophia's father added, "You got married without the elder's permission. In our hometown, that's grounds for a public beating." Her father, "Stop wasting your breath. Sophia said we should get him to agree to the divorce right away," she said, glaring at me. Then she put on a fake smile and said, "Dr. James, I know it's not easy for you to get to where you are. If you agree to the divorce, we'll leave immediately. If not, my husband and I will stay here and tell everyone about you and my daughter." My knuckles turned white as I clenched my fists and swept a small potted plant off the desk onto the floor. I wanted to yell back, but my upbringing wouldn't allow it. I took a deep breath and said succinctly, "Get out." The two of them were startled by the sound of the plant hitting the floor and grumbled as they turned to leave. "What a coward, acting all high and mighty," they muttered. No more patients came in for the rest of the day. Robert tried to speak to me several times but stopped himself. I caught glimpses of Sophia's parents lingering outside the door. Robert finally came in and said awkwardly, "Dr. James, the vice president wants to see you." I knew what the vice president wanted to say. I nodded at Robert and got up. In the hallway, I ran into Sophia and her parents again. They glanced at me and pretended not to see me, continuing their propaganda. When I entered the vice president's office, his face was somewhat stern. "James, I know you're married to a patient, and I shouldn't have a problem with that. But as you can see, the patient's parents have been causing a disturbance in the hospital, severely disrupting our order. Our security can't even remove them. You know, for a private hospital like ours, reputation is everything. You need to handle this and take some time off afterward." I mechanically responded, "Okay, I understand." Back at the clinic door, the two of them were still there. I walked up behind them and calmly said, "Go home and tell Sophia that I agree to the divorce." They turned around, processing my words, and gradually their faces lit up with delight. They wanted to say something thankful, but I continued, "Now, get out of my clinic door and out of the hospital."
Having gotten the answer they wanted, they didn't press further and left happily. I watched their retreating figures. Sophia, are you really going to push me to the brink? That evening, as expected, Sophia hadn't come home yet. I called her, and this time, she answered right away. It was very quiet on her end, but I sensed something was off. I spoke first. Sophia, I've agreed to the divorce. Sophia responded without any emotion, that's good. I looked at the documents on the coffee table and said, come home tonight and sign the divorce agreement. Sophia was somewhat surprised and said, tonight? Where are you? I'll pick you up. Sophia was silent for a moment, and I continued, the sooner we get it over with, the sooner you can get the money. Sophia was tempted and said excitedly, then come pick me up at this hotel. She sent me an address on WeChat. I looked at the note that said wife and felt a bitter taste in my heart. I asked reluctantly, did you go to a hotel with David? Sophia let out an awkward laugh and said, since we're getting divorced anyway, what does it matter? What does it matter? I remembered when Sophia proposed, and I asked her about her parents. Sophia had laughed awkwardly and said, since we're getting married, what does it matter what they think? Then she looked up at me, her eyes shining like the sun. At that moment, she was so brave and radiant. I drove to the address Sophia had sent me. In front of the luxurious hotel, I saw Sophia, and next to her, David, who was supporting her. I didn't even bother to park the car properly. I rushed out, quickly walking up to them. David spoke up with a grin, Sophia's a bit drunk. Before he could finish, I punched him in the face. David didn't expect that and stumbled backward. He looked at me in disbelief, letting go of Sophia, are you f***ing crazy? He shouted and lunged at me, starting a fight. Although I had the initial advantage, I had no physical training growing up. In a street brawl with someone like David, I was naturally outmatched. Bruises began to form on my forehead and the corners of my mouth. Just as I was knocked to the ground and David was about to pin me down, a figure lunged forward, stop fighting. It was Sophia. I remembered a time when a patient's parent, believing his child's self-harm was my fault, had stormed into the clinic. At that time, I was giving Sophia a therapy session. The man burst in, wielding a kitchen knife. In that first moment, Sophia turned around, facing him and shielding me. She had been so brave, trying to protect me from that burly man and his knife. But now? She hugged David, soothing him gently, stop fighting. If it gets out of hand, you'll be detained, and that won't be good for you. David, panting heavily, gradually calmed down. He didn't look much better than me, his hair was disheveled, his nose was bleeding, and one of his eyes was swollen. Sophia tenderly touched his wounds. I lay on the ground, slowly closing my eyes. The injuries were minor, but Sophia still called 911. When the ambulance arrived, Sophia helped David into the vehicle. The medical staff saw me lying on the ground and pulled me in as well. I didn't miss the disdainful glance Sophia gave me as I was loaded into the ambulance. It was quite a coincidence that we ended up at the hospital where I worked. The entire way, doctors and nurses stared at us in astonishment. After some examinations, I was diagnosed with a mild concussion and needed to stay in the hospital for observation. A nurse handed me some paperwork and hesitated beside me before finally speaking, Dr. James, there's something off about the couple who came in with you. I tilted my head slightly, signaling for her to continue. Their pupils are dilated, which is a sign of stimulant use. I didn't do a precise comparison, but I suspect they were on drugs. My mind felt like it had suddenly been electrified. No wonder Sophia had trouble sleeping at night. No wonder she seemed to be cold recently, even though it was summer and she wore a lot of clothes. No wonder she let out strange screams, seemed overly excited, and had unstable emotions. I had thought she was being deceived by David, and that I still had a chance to persuade her. But I was wrong. David was her supplier, and she was already hooked on him, both physically and mentally. She was completely under his control. Seeing that I wasn't responding, the nurse continued, we also took the initiative to do a urine test on them, and the results will be out soon. I looked at her and replied, I know. Thank you. The nurse looked at me worriedly but didn't say anything further. She covered me with a blanket and left. I remembered when I was treating Sophia, and we were in the middle of the therapy. She once told me, Dr. James, I feel like I'm falling into a whirlpool, but I'm also dragging you in. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. I knew she was kind-hearted, she was afraid of becoming too dependent on others and spreading her negative emotions. I couldn't help but take her hand and say, no, I will save you when the time comes. Then she smiled, a smile that held nothing back. At that moment, I knew she had placed all her trust in me. But now? She had placed all her trust in another man, a man who wanted to drag her into the abyss. Sophia, how could you be so naive? The next day, I applied for discharge. Before that, the vice president came to see me again, and his expression was even more stern than before. He said, "The fight has had a very negative impact on the hospital's reputation. You need to be suspended for now." I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to go home. When I got home, I was surprised to see Sophia sitting on the sofa, with the divorce agreement in front of her. Hearing the noise, she looked up and said expressionlessly, "You're back. Sign the agreement quickly." I noticed she was trembling all over. I remembered what the nurse had said. The urine test results from yesterday were positive. It felt like all my strength had been drained these past few days, and I could only speak in a weak voice. "Sophia, have you been using drugs?" Her calm face twisted in an instant, and she shouted, "None of your business." I continued to explain, "You know it's illegal." Sophia stood up, her entire body shaking. I saw the glint of the knife in her hand. She staggered toward me, shouting, "I don't need you to tell me what to do." I didn't resist as the sharp knife pierced my body. I smelled the strong, rusty odor of blood. The floor was slippery, and I couldn't stand. I slowly slid down. Sophia didn't stop. She kept stabbing me, screaming hysterically, "Don't control me! Don't control me! Don't control me!" In that moment, I felt myself becoming lighter. I was floating in midair. I knew I was dead. I watched as Sophia continued to stab me frantically. I was unrecognizable, like a smashed watermelon. Blood still flowed, spreading across the entire living room. Sophia finally collapsed from exhaustion. She looked around blankly, then crawled to the coffee table and grabbed her phone. You come in." "I didn't mean to." She choked up and couldn't continue. The front door opened, and David, who had been waiting outside, entered. He let out a dry retch as he opened the door. He slowly walked in, glanced at my shattered body in the pool of blood with disgust, then grabbed Sophia, who was still sitting on the floor, and shook her shoulders violently. "I gave you the knife to threaten him, not to kill him. What are we going to do now? You killed someone, and I'm implicated too. We'll both end up in jail, and we won't even have time to spend the money." No matter how hard David shook her, Sophia remained silent. Finally, David let go of her shoulders, turned her around, and pushed her into the bedroom. "Change your clothes quickly. Do you remember the bank card password? Let's go and enjoy ourselves first." He began to undress himself and Sophia, putting on the most luxurious and expensive clothes from the wardrobe. Throughout the entire process, Sophia remained like a puppet, manipulated by others. After changing their clothes, they headed straight to the most expensive hotel in the city and booked a presidential suite. As soon as they entered the room, David took out a handful of colorful pills from his bag and pried open Sophia's mouth. "Here, take some and you'll feel energetic." The way he fed her the pills was like feeding an animal. The pills took effect quickly. Within minutes, Sophia regained her vigor. She passionately kissed David, murmuring, "Chang, I love you so much." They stripped each other's clothes off and intertwined on the large bed. I couldn't bear to watch any longer and turned my face away, but the sounds of their intimacy still reached my ears. I remembered the time when Sophia showed me her admission letter. I offered her a polite congratulations. She bit her lip, as if making a big decision, took 2 steps forward, and hugged me tightly. Sophia's entire body was trembling, but she still whispered, "Dr. James, don't push me away. I really like you." She held me so tightly that I had no idea she could be so strong, as if she wanted to merge me into her very being. I knew how much effort it took for her to confess, and I felt a pang of heartache. I gently touched the top of her head. At that moment, I made up my mind to protect her. But now, Sophia was with another man, using my credit card to stay in the most luxurious room, engaging in intimate acts. When they got tired, they took drugs and continued their frenzy. After a few hours, David, panting heavily, dialed a number. "Mark, bring a few more people over to join us." After hearing David's words, I left. I couldn't bear to see Sophia in that state anymore. I wanted to go home, even though it was no longer our home. A small crowd had gathered outside my front door. An old lady muttered, "I just heard screams coming from this apartment," and then it went silent. What could have happened? A middle-aged man with glasses adjusted his spectacles and said, "For safety's sake, let's call the police." The police arrived quickly, and the landlord used a spare key to open the door. The people gathered outside gasped in unison. The two who had spoken earlier leaned against the wall and vomited. An investigation was launched immediately, and Sophia was summoned for questioning. She was still under the influence of the drugs when she sat in the interrogation room. She claimed to know nothing in response to the police's questions.
It wasn't until they presented the undeniable evidence of her fingerprints on the knife that she burst into tears. The police thought they had made a breakthrough, but she only repeated, "I have severe depression." It was an accidental killing. No matter what the police said, she kept saying the same thing. An assisting officer whispered, "Someone must have coached her to say that," thinking that claiming a mental issue would reduce her sentence. At that moment, another officer entered and whispered into the lead detective's ear, "Michael, you were right. She did use drugs." Michael's gaze deepened. "Find her source." David was brought in soon after, still with his usual smug grin. "Officer, what can I do for you?" The young officer slammed his hand on the table. "David, stop playing games. Aren't you tired of coming to the police station every day?" David laughed. "If you don't mind the daily drug tests, why would I?" The young officer looked at him with disdain. "You spend your days luring young women into buying addictive drugs." Before David could retort, Michael sneered, "Joseph, don't waste your breath. David, stop pretending. Sophia has already confessed. She's the one who killed him." David's expression flickered with panic for a moment, but he quickly resumed his smirk. "She killed him. What does that have to do with me? I didn't incite her." Michael's smile took on a triumphant air. "Who said you didn't incite her?" David's smile finally faded, and a cold sweat dripped down his face. This time, it was Michael's turn to look smug. "David, we didn't have enough evidence to catch you on drug charges before, but this time, it's different." In reality, Michael was bluffing. The testimony Sophia gave while still under the influence of drugs couldn't be considered valid. David was clever in his own way. With his good looks, he would charm girls into buying ecstasy and then share it with them. He had many informants and knew how to avoid drug raids, so urine tests could never catch him. However, he was also ignorant of the law. A little intimidation was all it took for him to break down and confess everything. He had hoped for leniency through confession, but this time, he had dug his own grave. Sophia's mental state remained in a daze. Experts conducted a psychiatric evaluation on her, and the results indicated severe depression, bipolar disorder, and serious neurasthenia. Upon hearing this, Joseph muttered, "So it's true. I thought she..." Michael glared at him and said, "She has a history of illness. Watch your words." Joseph immediately fell silent. That history was part of Sophia's life that I had been involved in. Sophia's parents, realizing they wouldn't get the money to persuade me to divorce her and that they couldn't get the house and car registered in her name, began to defame me online. They called me a fraud, accused me of marrying their daughter under false pretenses, and even claimed I had molested underage girls. However, there were also people who spoke up for me, saying, "Dr. James is a good person. He helped patients recover, gave them hope for life, and gave them the courage to keep living." Some of Sophia's former classmates also came forward, revealing evidence of her parents' domestic violence. I was grateful to them. In the end, David was sentenced to 10 years in prison for inciting a crime that led to a death. Sophia was sentenced to life imprisonment for involuntary manslaughter, but due to her mental condition, the sentence was suspended. The last time I saw Sophia was in the psychiatric hospital. She lay on the bed like a piece of porcelain, being roughly handled by the nursing staff. Her parents stood by, indifferent. Sophia's mother, looking at her daughter who had lost all sense of self, turned to her husband and said, "Are we really that failures?" Sophia's father held her hand and replied, "Of course not. We've done our best. This child has everything she needs, yet she doesn't know where she went wrong." Sophia's mother turned her head and smiled, "Let's go. She's useless now. We'll do IVF and have another child." They walked away without a backward glance, not even a single look. At that moment, I hated myself for not being a vengeful ghost, unable to strangle them. I looked at the now quiet Sophia, but what appeared before me was her from high school. It was the first time she came to see me, dressed in her school uniform, looking like a plant that hadn't seen the sun for too long. She held a crumpled bill in her hand, gently placed it on the table, and timidly said, "Dr. James, this is all I have. I'm very sick. Can you please treat me?" I looked at Sophia lying in the hospital bed, wearing a patient's gown. She was as thin as when we first met, her eyes as lifeless as a statue, devoid of any emotion. There was no trace of the progress I had helped her make over the years. In my heart, I silently said, "Sophia, this time, I can't help you anymore.